Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Working Democracy. I apologize for our late start today, but I'm sure it will be worth it. Today, I'm with Anand Gopal. Anand's an award-winning journalist and contributing writer at The New Yorker. He's a sociologist by training and holds a doctorate from Columbia University. His first book, No Good Man Among the Living, is an account of America's war in Afghanistan, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. He's won multiple awards for his reporting on Iraq and Syria. And finally, he's a professor of practice here at Arizona State University in the Future Security Initiative, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and the Center for Working Democracy. He's also the founding director of the Zomia Center, which supports people in non-state spaces who often have difficulty accessing humanitarian resources as well as the kind of state support they often need. Anand, welcome.
Nice to be here.
So today we're talking about Days of Hope and Rage, a story of ordinary people forging a revolution, which is about a city in Syria during the Civil War. And you sort of give an account of a very unusual experiment that took place there in the middle of what must have been very, very difficult circumstances. Maybe you can start by just telling us a brief synopsis of sort of what this book is about in your view and what drew you to it as an object of study.
Sure, thanks. Just to give some context, the book is about a city in northern Syria called Manbij. It's a place that most Syrians probably hadn't even heard of or thought much about before 2011. It's a population of about 250,000 people. And beginning in 2011, there was a protest movement across Syria to try to overthrow the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad, which had been in power for 40 years. And in this city, this protest movement eventually succeeded in overthrowing the dictator, even though in other cities, the dictator was still in power. So what commenced for the next 18 months was a really remarkable experiment in democracy in which ordinary people were forced to confront the question of how they should run their own society. And in doing so, were forced to confront some of the more basic questions that we may take for granted about what does democracy mean, what does freedom mean, etc. So the book tries to tell that story through the points of views of 5 or 6 individuals.
So the 5 or 6 individuals come from different social positions, different locations in Manbij society. But the reconstruction of their lives is probably one of the most notable aspects of this book. I mean, you describe their childhoods, you describe their early experiences, a lot of which are experiences of the state or the economy as it was changing over decades. And some of the stories start decades and decades ago, way before the Syrian civil war began. And just thinking about that as a project of reconstruction, I have 2 sort of basic questions. One is, how were you able to reconstruct these elaborate life histories of people? And 2, if the purpose was really to describe an unfolding sort of democratic experiment, urban municipal democratic experiment, what is the purpose of those elaborate reconstructions at the expense of, say, maybe describing more about what was going on in the city during the Civil War?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in order to understand what the protesters were up against when trying to build this new democratic experiment, it's important to understand the backdrop of 40 years of dictatorship. What does it mean to live in a dictatorship? Why is it that if this was an oppressive society for 40 years, why did people only rise up in 2011, not in the 1970s or 1980s? So the book shows the transformations in the economy over those years, in which the government privatized many basic services, and many people who had previously acquiesced to political repression because they were getting some economic benefits. Now they're in a situation where they had neither economic support or political rights. So I think that backdrop was really important to try to understand. And then, when the protesters when people go out and first decide to protest, I think it's hard for some of us here to really understand the type of bravery, the sacrifice that's required to do so. And I thought that it's easier to understand that if we really can see the kind of the full trajectory of people's lives. So yeah, the book starts in some cases in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, and it goes through the experiences of different individuals. One person was a poet and philosopher who ends up in prison for 16 years because he put up on the wall some anti-government slogans. He got arrested in the 1980s. There's another person who's kind of sort of everyman working class person who ends up trying just to make ends meet and gets afflicted by the economic transformations of the 2000s. So all of these people come from different walks of life. None of them were very political. None of them had given much thought to political philosophy or political theory. They were just trying to make ends meet and go through their lives. And somehow all of them by 2011 became these revolutionary actors. So I was interested in seeing how that transformation takes place. And in reporting that, trying to get the texture of people's lives, I realized very quickly as I interviewed people that I'm going to face a number of problems. One is, yes, I'm asking people to remember things that happened years earlier, in which case they may misremember or they may selectively remember. Secondly, I was interviewing them in the context of a civil war, and so there was lots of intrigue and rivalries. And so to be able to piece through all that, I very quickly realized that I was not able to do that alone as a researcher. And so I ended up recruiting other Syrian revolutionaries who were from the city of Manbij who took part in all these events. And at its height, I think we had something like 15 other researchers. And so this whole team of people would go and interview their own friends and comrades who were with them on the barricades. And in that way, one, they were able to get people to open up more and trust, because people would trust their neighbors and friends more than an outsider. And two, we were able to get sort of more detail and texture because we were able to cross-check a lot of details. And say I interview somebody and they don't remember something that happened, but we have 4 other people who remember something, and then we can triangulate it through that way. And then thirdly, and this becomes more apparent in the middle of the book as we describe kind of blow by blow what the democratic experiment looked like, I made use of a lot of newspapers. So Syria was a place for 40 years. It was a 2 state-run newspapers. But in the 18-month democratic experiment period, there were dozens of newspapers that were created overnight, ranging from left-wing papers to conservative papers. And these are people, just ordinary citizens who just would write something, mimeograph it, and hand it out on the street corners, for example. So I was able, me and the researchers were able to collect all of these newspapers, and also a lot of social media. Syria is one of the first social media conflicts. People were going out on their phones and filming protests. So all of that voluminous reams of data that we were able to collect to kind of research people's stories and get some of the texture that I thought was needed to tell the story.
So we were talking a little bit about the really Herculean efforts you went through to capture the whole lives of the 6 people that you focus on in particular, although there are other people that are sort of rendered in pretty serious detail. And, I guess the first thing to say is they're not cardboard cutouts. They're not representatives of, say, an ideology or a social position or a position relative to the market economy, which is often how sociologists, for example, characterize people, right? They're significant in a story because they represent something, right? And in some ways, your subject represents something, and maybe I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. But in some ways, it's clear that you find that sort of, here is Abalas. Is that pronounced his name right?
Yeah.
Here's Abalas. He is a working class shop owner, or poor shop owner, who's struggling in a market economy. Here's what he said on this day, right? And instead you write 70 pages about him, sort of reconstructing his life, his views, and so on. So, they're really, my assumption is that when you invest that much effort in rendering an individual, that it's not simply about not wanting to caricature them, but tell me about your thinking as you were writing and making these decisions about how you're going to invest your time, but also with research. I mean, you must have taken multiple interviews to capture these stories.
Yeah, so Abelos, for example, when we meet him, he is a young boy and works in his father's bubblegum stand. So in the city of Manbij, which itself is a fairly poor city. He's a very, very poor individual, very poor family, and we follow his life as he strives to just have a slightly bigger shop. And for a while, that seems to work. He ends up going around the country working as a day laborer, which was a very common experience for a lot of Syrians at the time. And then in the early 2000s, Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafez al-Assad, comes to power, and um, he enacts a series of economic reforms that lead to the cutting of some basic subsidies, which a lot of Syrians were using to survive, including fuel subsidies, for instance, as well as privatizing a lot of services. This creates a situation in which Abalos is no longer able to sort of hope for a bigger shop or build a second wing to his shop.
Which he was clearly striving to do.
And yes, that this is his main ambition in life is to build a shop. And so very quickly he runs into debt. He ends up falling prey to loan sharks, and he loses everything in the end. He loses his shop. He ends up as a migrant worker in Lebanon. And so all of that is kind of a fairly typical experience of many poor and working class Syrians. But so I was interested, like, as a sociologist, in trying to capture that particular experience. But of course, the moment you sit down with anybody and you really start to get to know them, you'll see all the ways in which they don't fit the prototype. And in his case, for instance, he becomes a sort of revolutionary leader who, when the city, and we can talk about this more later, when the city is divided along class lines between working class people and more elites, you would think he would side with the working class against the elites. And he does for a while, but then he quickly switches sides and kind of supports the elites for interesting and complicated reasons that make sense. So that's an example, I think, of how the moment you zoom into any individual life, things are always more complicated and complex than taking the bird's eye view. And why I took that approach, well, I wanted to make all of these characters' decisions legible. I wanted to see what would it look like for us to be in their shoes and to be confronted with the choices that they had to make. And even if we don't always agree with their choices, we can make sense of those choices. And to do that, I really needed to follow the detail of their lives and sort of from childhood onwards. So if we just met Abalos in the middle of the revolution and he's acting as this rabble rouser, it would make a lot less sense without knowing this extensive back history. So that was sort of the approach for all the characters that I took.
Well, right, and I mean, in a way, I almost feel like you're underplaying it a little bit. So Abalos, as a young man, the first movie that he sees is Enter the Dragon.
Right.
So he becomes obsessed with karate, and he actually becomes an expert at it.
Yeah.
Right. And he learns a habit of resilience. And so he's quite stoic as he goes through all these horrible things that happen to him. And he's quite even keeled. And so gets respected in his community. And in the middle of the revolution, when people are trying to figure out what side they're on, and they're navigating, the youth movement and the council and all that kind of stuff, he's known as kind of a hero, but he ends up with a sort of profound respect for Hassan.
Right.
Who's a fundamentally different kind of person. So why don't you describe him for a second?
So Hassan is also comes from a very poor background, but he's quite gifted intellectually, academically at least, and so he ends up attending Aleppo University, which is a pretty big deal for somebody from his background. He becomes a poet of some repute, and also gets drawn into political activism. Now, this is in the 70s and 80s. At the time, Hafez al-Assad is in power, and there's a two-pronged insurgency in the country, one by the Muslim Brotherhood, and two by a smattering of left-wing groups, Arab nationalist groups and leftist groups. And so Hassan gets drawn into the left-wing side of this and joins a political party, which in those days, joining a political party was a capital offense. So he does this. He becomes this organizer. He's ferrying newspapers to different parts of the country, and at some point and this is all a secret life he's leading while he's a sort of celebrity on campus as this well-regarded poet. At some point, he puts up some flyers on the university wall, and he ends up getting arrested. And when he's arrested, he's told he's just going to be taken for 15 minutes for questioning. Turns out he was gone for 15 years. he ends up in some of the worst dungeons on earth, including 5 years in the prison of Palmyra, a prison that was so horrible that when Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, he thought it was too brutal for Syria, and he shut it down. So, and while in prison, he ends up discovering Hegel, and begins to see his trials and tribulations as part of a larger stream of history, and sees that there's some kind of purpose through which history is moving, and his sacrifice actually contributes to this purpose, and it helps him get through prison.
It's probably the best review you could have as a philosopher.
Yes, and maybe it's the only conditions one should probably tackle Hegel is in prison. And so this experience is really important because when in 2011, when the protests start, most of the people who take part in the protest have never thought about politics before in their lives. They've never had to deal with organizing a protest or the nuts and bolts of activism. It's never crossed their minds, except for Hassan, because Hassan had been in the underground for years. He had learned to think not just tactically, but learned to think strategically. And so he was able to impart this upon his fellow protesters in a way that had a pretty transformative role in the protest movement. Because one of the challenges the protesters faced was there were just about 100 protesters in a city of 200,000, because most people were terrified to take part. So these 100 people were always trying to figure out how can we convince the people sitting on the fence to join our side. And it was Hassan who realized that one of the things that the protesters need to do is they can't just have a negative program, like let's overthrow the dictator. They need to have a positive vision for what they want to replace it with, so that people can feel inspired to take their own risks. And so he comes up with this idea of a revolutionary council, which was a body of protesters which would act as a kind of government in waiting and eventually take over the city. And so they would put out these manifestos, and they would appear overnight on car windshields and posted on walls. And there was a sense in the city that there was actually somebody waiting to take over, so people didn't fear chaos. And this brought more and more people out to protest, while the government was shooting at unarmed protesters. And so this turned the tide, and it was pretty instrumental in eventually leading to 50, 100,000 person strong protests that overthrew the dictatorship in the city.
So back to Abu
Yeah.
I mean, he is very different from Hassan, but he ends up respecting Hassan greatly, even though other people find Hassan intolerable.
Right.
Because he went through 15 years of basically torture and came out the other side. And Abu who values resilience and a degree of stoicism and thinks of himself that way, is sort of looking at Hassan going, whatever I've been through, it's not.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And it sort of reveals something, because, this tale probably can easily be told in terms of ideological factions, right? Again, or social positions, right, and things like that. But in your rendering, these end up being tales about character.
Right.
And it's not just Hassan and Abu Los. I mean, any number of people start making decisions on the basis of who they're friends with, people's behavior. Ode and Abdul have a very tense relationship, because right, Ode basically outs him, right, and gets him arrested. But they end up being allies for a while too. They reunite because right, probably they're rooted in years of friendship and things like that. Ibrahim abandons the armed struggle when he realizes that these people are just thieves. Everybody's making these decisions on criteria that aren't the way that we would normally think about this, right? Yeah,
it's a very astute observation. I think one of the things that I'm very interested in and actually really learned from in reporting this is the way in which people's habits of character can be refracted through various experiences to become a political position. And it's not something that, one would normally think of when we think of ideology, in a way. So Abelos is a perfect example. He saw Enter the Dragon and was transfixed by Bruce Lee when he was 11 or 12, and then became dedicated to the craft of karate and everything that took. And yes, that taught him resilience, which is a character trait. It taught him that if he developed that character trait, which allowed him to withstand the vicissitudes of economic dislocation and political dislocation. Another example would be Abdul Hadi, who, when we meet him in the book, he's a rising soccer star, and he has dreams of making it to the big leagues in Syria. He's also from a very poor background, and so he lacks the access to resources that one would need to really devote time to practicing instead of going and working after school. So his dreams are frustrated. He ends up instead as a gym teacher. But he is somebody who he comes from a small family that were transplants to the city. He always had a chip on his shoulder, always had a sense of inferiority. And for a moment with the revolution, it felt like that everyone was now equal, and that was an intoxicating feeling for him. But as the revolution progressed, the inequalities, the structural inequalities in the society began to appear again. And so he was somebody who bore a lot of resentment. And, this is a recognizable feeling for people to have resentment, to have a chip on their shoulder. But put that kind of feeling in the maelstrom of a revolution and civil war, and it can end up taking people into a very surprising direction, and which is what happens to him.
Yeah. And, many of the characters are sort of flip-flopping around, trying to find their way. But it's almost as if, I don't know what you think about this, but, it's almost as if things had to be evaluated in terms of character and morality, it seems like that would be a relatively clear-cut decision for a lot of people. And if it's instead being evaluated in terms of the mechanisms through which you elect your leadership, or your view on the market economy, things get a lot fuzzier for a lot of these people.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you think of is the value of that sort of observation, because, again, the rendering suggests that you have quite a lot of respect for these people and their views, right? But my guess is that they were asked to define their political ideology today, even after going through all this and getting a better political education than I've had, they would probably not be completely clear cut, whereas I would be very confident stating, I feel this about the market economy, or I feel this about the structure of democracy.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think it's easier, I feel the same as you, and I think it's easier with some distance to make those claims. I think the people who live through these trajectories, one of the questions I ask towards the end of the book, after it appears, after the democratic experiment has failed and the dictator has reasserted himself, and it appears for years and years as if the whole thing was for naught. 100,000 people were killed, and they ended up more or less in the same place that they started. I asked people, was it worth it to them? And it was, I would get varied answers to that. Very few people just unequivocally said no, though. But very few people also, to your point, didn't come away with like pristine political positions about, here's a lesson we should take about free market economies or democracy, in part because of the messiness of what they're living. Well, I think this is true for most people, and usually it's people like Hassan, the more political people who have much more coherence in their views, and often people don't. There's moments in where people come into coherence, and there was a moment for 18 months where people did have well articulated positions about these things, and you can say these are ideological positions, but that's a momentary thing, and maybe the status quo generally is much more people have a morass of contradictory ideas.
Well, and even in that moment, I mean, because we know the characters so well, we also know, so they're all pro-revolution.
Right.
It's clear that they are pro-revolution for very different reasons.
Right.
And they probably all have a canned reason. We hate the dictator and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But they also have underlying motivations, which are radically different. Right. And that gets to be revealed.
Exactly.
So, what do you think that says about, the way that we think about these kinds of revolutionary moments and possibilities? And because in some ways, it suggests that there's an inchoate issue of character, personality, and motivation. A woman that I know argues that, ideologies are easy to come by, but motivations, we're all our inner 12-year-old, right? And that's much more complicated, right? And, you see a bit of that in this book. Um, what does that say about trying to stitch together a coherent collective action or governance mechanism or something like that in a revolutionary moment? Because we often think about it as, well, they didn't do this. They didn't disarm their opponents, or they didn't, they didn't put a price cap on bread. They didn't do this or that, and that's why this failed. Right, but you're suggesting a much more complicated problem, or am I overstating that significantly?
No, I think that's right. I think, and in some cases, you can have um, revolutionary networks, political organizations, etc., that can exist prior to the moment of revolution, right? And in those cases, those entities can act. Trotsky famously said, "The political party is a memory of the working class," for example. Those networks can act as repositories of knowledge, of learned experience, and then they can intervene in moments of upheaval, right? So that's one model. That's happened historically, of course. These days, I think what happened in Syria is much more likely, is what we're seeing, is the second model, which is that in a completely depoliticized society, all of a sudden sort of the leaders are overthrown and people come out into the streets. And here, I think, is where all these sort of ex ante features of character and idiosyncrasies of people become even more important. Not that they're not important in the more traditional mode, but even more important here because there's no countervailing force of a political party or some other institutions that can really kind of force people to kind of cohere in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So just a note for anybody, for those of you who are watching, if you would like to put questions for Anand in the chat, at the end of our session, I will be asking him your questions. So if you have something, please put it in. So moving on to a different set of issues. We have this experiment in democracy in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, the middle of the Civil War. So in one of their very early meetings where they're trying to figure out how to govern themselves, they get bombed by the Syrian Air Force. It's difficult. Robert's Rules of Order has no procedure for what to do when you're under air attack. And yet, in a way, it almost doesn't change that much, except people's attitudes about the government. And I guess a much more elevated sense of what we need to do about that.
Right.
But, you're quite clear, you have this sort of amazing moment early on, which you sort of pass over. But the first time that they're deciding who should run the organization that's going to start coordinating protests, this is the first vote that any of them have ever participated in their lives, right? And Hassan, who's the intellectual, he's read Hegel and Stendhal and all kinds. He was a fan of the Romantics after he got tired of Kant and all that. But even he doesn't have a tremendous political education. And yet again, you're sort of rendering these moments where people are deciding how to proceed with a great deal of care, right? So again, what is it about these moments that seem to warrant such care on your part?
In talking to the protagonists who took part in this, often they would bring up certain key moments as transformational for them. So the moment you were referencing, takes place early on when the protests just start in the city. This is the dictator still in control of the city, and you just have a few dozen people who are really risking their lives to go out and protest. And they realize pretty quickly that they need to have some form of coordination or organization to do so. Clandestine necessarily, but still they need to organize. And so they all get together in secret, I believe in a farmhouse, and try to figure out how they can do this. And they are not sure they trust each other. Most of them don't really know each other prior to this meeting. And they realize that to organize, they need to hold people accountable. So then they kind of tepidly go in and have this vote. It's the first time they ever had a vote. And now, years later, when you ask people to describe the democratic experiment or the revolution, they always went back to this moment as a key moment, where they began to have a sense of their own potential power and agency for the first time in their lives. And then there are other key moments like that. And so in those moments where they felt to be key, I always tried to zoom in a bit, interview as many people as I could. I believe in that meeting there's maybe 10 people, so I tried to interview all of them, but then also tried to find any documents, etc. Often I actually went to the place where the meeting happened just so I can get a sense of the atmospherics there. So yeah, it was really trying to track what they also themselves thought was a key turning point.
So turning point makes a lot of sense, but I think that they're
or inflection point, let's say.
Inflection point, yeah. Clearly. There's the question of the kind of resources and learning that goes on in any social movement, right? How do we work together?
Yeah.
What are the values that are going to govern our behavior with each other and with our opponents? We were talking earlier about how for many of these people, there are issues of character, especially early on before they have to make hard choices about what do we stand for. It's just opposition is ideologically easy, right? And it can encompass any number of positions. But once you have to start being proactive, that changes the nature of what you're doing. Even early on, there are these sorts of descriptions where it almost seems like there are social achievements that are being undertaken that seem almost banal in some ways. We're going to decide this by a vote. We're actually going to put the working class guy in charge of the protest organization because he actually knows people. And where's a good idea to do something, right? That gets to a whole issue of relationship to space and even the space of the city, right? Which becomes really important at various points here. You engage at a number of points in the book with various aspects of sociology. You discuss the collective action problem at one point, although you also discuss why this is not necessarily the best framework to deal with all of these issues. I always say that if we're looking at a movement, it's because to some degree the collective action problem has been overcome.
Right.
It's not actually that big a problem. It's a problem in moments, but if we're reading about it, it's because we heard about it because they solved it.
Right.
But other people appear. Alistair McIntyre appears talking about narratives. There's an extended, interesting debate between an ISIS commander and one of the revolutionaries about democracy and religion, secularism. In a way, what we're seeing is the unfolding of decades of political theoretical discussion,
right,
but on the ground.
Right.
Why is that important for people to know, do you think?
So, to the extent that we've heard about these political theories, and people discuss Locke in the book, and Aristotle comes up, etc. I think it's often presented to us, especially if we've learned it in school, as kind of abstract, as dry, as removed from our everyday experience. It's often unclear to see where the importance lies in thinking about these ideas and thinking about their theories. What was really fascinating for me to learn in the course of researching this is the way in which this emerged organically from people dealing with the exigencies of having to cobble together a democracy. For example, there was a question of what role should religion play, and this is something to deal with that. They had to actually confront the idea: what do we mean by secularism? Because people are bandying around the term secularism. Right? Does it mean atheism? Does it mean separation of mosque and state? Does it mean something else? And there emerged different ideas of what secularism should mean. And another example would be the question of human rights, which gets debated, right? Because on the one hand, there was a way in which some activists were portraying what was happening in Syria as a human rights problem, that the civilians were being killed. But there are others who are saying, well, human rights is almost like a series of don'ts. Don't kill, don't torture, etc., which is good. But where do the positive obligations come from? Or do we have positive obligations to each other? Does the international community have positive obligations to the Syrian revolution or not? These are questions that a human rights discourse kind of elides in a way. And so, and they were forced to come up with these, to confront these because they were getting bombed by the regime, civilians were being killed. There was a lot of rhetoric around the world about human rights violations in Syria, but at the same time, that wasn't really changing anything on the ground. And they're facing this crisis of affordability. So, these ideas are coming up, and some of the more learned, let's say, academically learned folks in the revolution were putting names to these theories and calling them, invoking Locke and etc. But a lot of people weren't, and we're still debating the same ideas. And there were, as I mentioned, there was newspapers that were published, and these newspapers had these debates in the pages, and people would go out to the street corners and read them aloud to others, and people would gather around and listen.
So early on in my academic career, I was studying the emergence of popular radicalism as their sort of pro-democracy movements in the United Kingdom, right, in the 1790s, roughly through the 1830s, right? And, these are moments when people were also debating Locke and Harrington and, all of these other people in the tradition. And, artisans are reading them aloud in their workshops, and they invent coffee houses as spaces of debate and all these kinds of things. And, in a way, it's very evocative of the same kind of thing, except that in those examples, it's often pretty heavily urban. It's pretty heavily artisanal. And it's in a nation, what becomes a nation that has an extensive history of such debates. Right. And some historians and historians of political thought would argue that those traditions were quite decisive in the emergence of these ideas. And, in the case of Syria, that's a lot thinner. So one thing that comes to mind is the role of religion in people's understanding of these issues, which comes up at various points. And I'd like you to talk about how important religion was in terms of giving people a framework. But it's not just Syria, it's also Manbij is described by you as, this is not an intellectual anthropo, right? I mean, you would have expected these debates in other cities, maybe Aleppo.
Damascus
or Damascus, and not here. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the place as well, to talk about how unusual this was and maybe why it was possible here versus those other places.
Right. So, there is a subterranean tradition of some of these debates because Syria had a brief democratic period in the 1950s. I don't really talk about this much in the book, but for about 6 or 7 years, it was the first democracy in the Arab world. It also had pretty strong political organizations on the right and left. So the Muslim Brotherhood was a pretty strong political organization on the right that had lots of chapters and branches, and they would have public meetings and lectures, etc. On the left, you also had both Arab nationalism, which is followers of either Nasser in Egypt or other versions of Arab nationalism, and you had the Communist Party. So you did have, and these are groups that in the democratic period had public lectures and debates and published books. So some of that, there's a residue of that tradition that's there. It doesn't get completely snuffed out by the dictatorship. Hassan is an example of somebody who kind of is a link to that older tradition in a way, and he's able to bring that to bear in the moments of uprising. So there's that. Then there's a second tradition, which is a very powerful one, which is Islam. And the way Islam is practiced goes through so many changes over the course of Syrian history, from being throughout most of the 19th and 20th century being a kind of syncretic Sufi-based religious practices. Really varies from community to community, to the rise in the 1970s of a more politicized Islam from the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, and then coming out of Saudi Arabia on the other. So you have these different traditions. Syrians going to be migrant workers to the Gulf, coming back home with different ideas of religion. So that's another kind of tradition that's that's happening, or sort of movement that's happening. And so in the democratic period, when there becomes a chasm between the rich and the poor and different conceptions of what this polity is for. So one group would say what we're trying to do is set up a polity that ultimately will let everybody kind of live the life they want to live as we please. That means freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, also freedom of markets. But another group tended to be poorer and more working class, saying freedom of speech and assembly is great, but freedom of markets not so much, because we're facing an affordability crisis. Rents are going through the roof because so many refugees are coming to Manbij. Also because there's no price controls, so the price of bread and fuel is spiraling. And so people are looking for a way to articulate that problem. And there was no strong left tradition. That's usually the left's job to articulate that, right? But the left in Syria had been eradicated or co-opted. Eradicated meaning various Communist Party and other groups were thrown in prison and killed by the Assads, or co-opted. So the Assad regime used some left-wing language, even though it was not in any way really left-wing. So without a left-wing tradition to articulate grievances around economics, Islam as another tradition was a resource that people were using to understand what was happening. And there's many different versions of this that were happening in the city, but one version was to say that, well, the reason why there is this kind of inequality in the city, and by the way, at the same time, there was a lot of criminality. So the reason why there was material and physical insecurity is because we've imported these foreign ideas from the West, liberalism, human rights. In fact, we here in Syria have our own tradition with a powerful set of resources to confront these problems, and that's the tradition of Islam. If you go back all the way to the time of the early caliphs, the first successors to Prophet Muhammad, that was a time in which, so these people believed, there was no rich and poor. There was all these economic problems were solved. And so there was a growing movement to harken back to those days that was only possible because of that long tradition that was there.
So that's contrary to how Islam is often presented to the public in the United States, but where we normally think about it as a intolerant ideology that's domineering and judgmental and so on like that. And secularists often see religion in that sort of way.
Right.
But it does. First, I guess the question is, do you think that these were rich traditions that actually enabled productive discussions about these kinds of issues in your rendering of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was debates between every week. There was these formations that emerged called assemblies, and these were basically political bodies that were sometimes like clubs, like the Jacobins, or sometimes like charities. It's unclear, dependent on the given assembly. There's some 40 assemblies. Some of them are based on occupation. Mm-hmm. So there was a teachers' assembly, lawyers' assembly, blacksmiths' assembly. Mm-hmm. Some were based on political ideology. Some were based on interest groups. And so these assemblies kind of formed a sea of participatory democracy inside the city. And one of the assemblies was called the Islamic Action Assembly, and their main goal was to try to reconcile Islam and secularism. This is what they tried to do. So they would put on these lectures every week, and they would bring people with more conservative interpretations of Islam and religious liberals and put them in dialogue and debate with each other. And this would just happen on a street corner, and anybody could be just going home from work and could stop at one of these lectures and see this. And one of the roles this inadvertently had, I think, is it slowly contributed to, as people grew disillusioned with the inequality and with the chaos, the early language of the uprising was entirely a language of human rights and liberalism. Right. Slowly, the language turned to one of religion, right? And it didn't turn to one of religion from the most extreme versions of religion, but like groups like this who actually believed that you can reconcile, let's say, religion and secularism in a fruitful way. They were starting to set up these debates, and this was an interesting and inadvertent way in which kind of the discourse changed.
So this is a reminder for people who are attending. If you would like to put questions in the chat, we'll be turning to those in about 5 or 10 minutes. Before we get there, let's think about the denouement of all of this. This is a fascinating experiment, but like many of these experiments, there are tragedies and there are disappointments. So you have a summary quote, which gets quoted in reviews. Probably because it does seem so nice. Democracy, like Promethean fire, could set loose the most fervent energies and tame the most rapacious giants. But like Prometheus, the activists of Manbij could not have guessed what they were about to unleash. Is it fundamentally transformative in ways that are productive? And you talked about how most people would say in retrospect that they have positive feelings about what happened, but you were also suggesting earlier that, but this is, there are definitely two sides to that story. Can we talk a little bit about what kind of contribution this made in the long term to Syria, to the Syrian people, and to the trajectory of it as not exactly a state, but something that some people aspire to make a state. Yeah.
So the democratic experiment described in the book lasted 18 months and succumbed after that to a dictatorship of ISIS, and then following that a dictatorship of Kurdish-backed groups. So 10 years of dictatorship almost. Then in an extraordinary turn of events in 2024, a rebel group ousted Assad, and all of a sudden, Manbij found itself to be in the conditions similar to what it was in the democratic experiment. People were talking about starting up the newspapers again, recreating these assemblies. This rebel group that has taken over Syria and runs Syria today was a former Islamist group, and I would describe them as would-be authoritarians.
Yeah.
Not really friendly to democracy. But what's interesting, and there's been massacres that have been committed by them, and a whole host of problems. But what I find the most interesting is that they are not able to exert the degree of authoritarian control over the country that Assad had been able to. I mean, so there is freedom of speech and assembly today, for all the problems Syria has. And I think that is not because these are incipient Democrats that are running the country, but it's because of the forms of social mobilization that were unleashed over the last 11, 12 years in the revolution. The memory of that is still very strong, and there have been plenty of protests against the new order. And in that sense, I think that the period that's described in this book, the democratic period, kind of did move the needle forward a little bit. And I describe in the book an example of the French revolutions. You have French Revolution of 1789, which ends in a dictatorship of Napoleon. Then you have another one in the 1830s, another one in 1848, another one in 1871. But each kind of revolution does build on the memory of what had gone before, so that they weren't starting from scratch each time. And I think that's very important to see. And if you look at the trajectory of France, just to become a standard democracy, it took 100 years of ordinary people rising up again and again and again, often being defeated in the moment, but in the longue durée, actually bequeathing something to future generations. And I think that's what we're seeing in Syria too.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one other way to view that, and I just want to ask you about this quickly, is the state capacity that the Ba'athists had isn't there for these.
Yeah.
They're sort of ragtag armies.
Yeah.
There's also probably a lot less state apparatus to seize. There is an interesting moment early on in the beginning of the success of the protest when Assad, they break into the police station. Assad says, "This is all yours." But my guess is that by this time there's not a lot of "this is all yours" left to seize in some ways.
Yeah, but it's a good point about state capacity, because this is a small rebel group that was not designed to run a whole country. Yeah. But that means they have to make alliances with other entities, local elites, local groups, different organizations. That itself is also a legacy of the revolution.
Yeah, right? Yeah, sure. All right, so let's turn to some. There's a question here about pre-existing political networks, which I think we talked a little bit about. So this is the 1950s sort of moment. We talked about the Muslim Brotherhood,
Yeah.
the communists, but there is a question there related to the book. So first, talk about that for a second. But also, we were talking about Hassan, and he gets thrown in prison for 15 years and tortured pretty relentlessly um, for pretty mild political activity. But how it's not exactly clear in the rendering how connected they were to sort of extensive networks, and how much was this sort of like a club where they take on a name that they or an idea that they know about and act in the name of that.
So just to deal with the first part of that question first. So in the 40s and 50s in Syria, you had several political currents, Muslim Brotherhood being one of them, Syrian Communist Party being another, Syrian Ba'ath Party, and then also other Arab nationalists who were following Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And they were all in a period of open contestation for about 6-7 years, running in elections, etc. And then, of course, there were the liberal parties, I should say, also, which were tied to the big oligarchs in the country. And what essentially happened is that the oligarchs who had been ruling the country since the 40s wanted to maintain their position, and all the other groups were advocating for, even the Muslim Brotherhood, advocating for forms of redistribution and more democratic forms of governance. Pretty quickly, the Brotherhood, though, changed tacks and allies itself with the souk traders and with the big landowners. Yeah. The reason they do so is because the Baathists and the Arab nationalists come to power, and they break up the big feudal estates in the country,
right?
And they redistribute land to the peasants, and they also put they monopolize trade. So this hurts the traders. So the two groups that are hurt by the Baathists most, the souk traders and the big feudal lords. Through their support to the Brotherhood. So the Brotherhood, since that point, always became kind of a reactionary force supporting these two entities. By the late 1970s, they've become an insurgency against the regime. At the same time, you have these left-wing groups that also start to, they're all outlawed once the Ba'ath Party comes to power. So they also start an insurgency. Hassan joins one Arab nationalist group that the reason they turn against the regime is because on Palestine. Because Hafez al-Assad regime portrayed itself to be the protector of the Palestinians against Israel, but in practice, what they're doing is manipulating the situation. They massacred Palestinians in Lebanon, and so these leftists saw this as a betrayal of the Arab nationalist cause and a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. So they joined the insurgency, and then of course the communists saw this as not a communist country, so they joined the insurgency. And when Hassan joins in the early 80s, his party, it is a political party. It's a group of friends in Manbij who are connected to a center, which is in Damascus. But because it was so illegal to join these parties, it was kind of this cell-like structure where you don't know anybody else in any of the other cells, and you have one go-between between them. So this was done to try to protect the security of those who were there. But it was a real political network. It wasn't just like a club.
So, the Muslim Brotherhood, I guess it gets most commonly discussed for its role in Egypt.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just a Syrian phenomenon. None of these, I guess the nationalists would be the most Syrian, although the idea of nationalism certainly isn't specific to Syria. A lot of these things have analogs in other places. I'm guessing you saw, I wonder, were the bizarre politics, were there any similarities with what you saw in Afghanistan, for example, or Pakistan?
So not in Afghanistan, just because in many ways Afghanistan had more pre-modern formations of politics. Sure. But I think more of a apt comparisons would be with either other Arab countries or with Iran. So famously in Iran, the clerical regime started with the backing among the souk traders, bazaar traders, right? Yeah. And very similarly with the Muslim Brotherhood, very much a party of the professional middle class and of traders, and not much of a base in the working class, in the industrialized working class or among the peasantry. And so that's why Muslim Brotherhood tend to be doctors and engineers, very highly educated individuals, and who had an outlook that would very, very much match the outlook of traders in that sense. So very supportive of capitalism supportive of capitalist-led development, very suspicious of any kind of wealth redistribution. This is what characterized the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, to this day, both in the Arab world and in Turkey.
So we have a question I think we discussed this a bit, but I do want to talk about it again for a second. This questioner is asking, are there ways the story you write is not captured by social science categories? And I think the answer is yes. We've discussed that a lot. Basically, social science categories don't exist. So even if when you're talking about economic transformations, you never give us a GDP table or something. Like that does not appear in this book. It's all told through the lives of people's experiences and things like that. But there is this idea which I think constantly keeps reemerging in the book, which is we have parties emerge, councils emerge, assemblies emerge, the Baathists emerge, and one of the basic problems, it seems to me, is that is the issue of character. That these come to be viewed as performances. And a lot of what your story is as authority kind of dissipates with your main characters, and it dissipates for different reasons with each of them, and on a different time scale for each of them. In a way, it fundamentally becomes about a lack of trust in the idea that people mean what they say. So Ode is probably one of the most interesting characters here because he keeps going around going, the president will solve this problem. And like even his uncle's finally like, get a grip. Takes him up for a motorcycle ride, says, get a grip. That's not how this works. But there is this disconnection between the categories we often use and the categories that actors use in describing themselves and their politics and sort of the experience of people with that. Talk about that a little bit and the role of that.
I think perfect example of this because we meet him in the beginning, kind of insouciant youth, this wayward and apolitical, interested in smoking hash and chasing girls, and he kind of gets inducted into politics inadvertently. He falls in love with this young woman and loses her, and through this gets kind of embittered and sees the world around him quite differently. And he was somebody who just thought pretty instinctually that the president was a good man. And by the way, he wasn't alone in that. Even as the protests began, a lot of Syrians said, okay, we know that our security services are terrible. We know there's a lot of corruption, but the president is somehow above the fray. And if he only knew how bad things were in the services, in government, he would step in and change things. And there was a moment after a few weeks of protests where he gave a national address, and everyone expected him to make reforms, and he didn't at all. And so this is the first moment in which the sort of the wool was being removed from people's eyes. And a lot of the stories here, and we didn't even talk, by the way, about Mina, who she one of the main characters, who also she's grown up as a woman in a very conservative society. Minbaj in particular is very conservative. She grows up with these notions of honor that are really deeply imprinted in her, and she sees terrible things that happen around her as kind of misfortunes, the way you might see like falling ill as a misfortune, and it takes she has to undergo kind of a transformation through the dint of experiences to see these as not as misfortunes but as injustices, because the moment you think of something as an injustice, then you think there's an alternative way it could be. So these are all ways in which people's kind of the stories they tell themselves begin to fall apart. And I think in one way of thinking about revolution in general is just that people have these prevailing views of how the world is, and that begins to fall apart. If that happens all at once, then you have a revolutionary situation, and that's what the book describes.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, that description that you have of Mina's moment when she transitions from interpreting everything as misfortunes to injustice is another terrific example of lay political philosophy, right? Where we're not talking about them as abstract concepts. We're talking about them as experiences that underpin shifting sort of consciousness and awareness about the differences between the way we think about things, right? And clearly, Mina also eventually gets to the point where, her idea of justice is also one where women are able to speak in public and,
Yeah.
moves on to these other things. So paternalism becomes a problem along with the state, right? But, in a way, I sort of wonder, like, does every revolutionary moment offer this richness of sort of political discussion? And I think part of what you're saying is yes.
I think so. I think so. I mean, I was fortunate to be able to access these people right after it happened. You wonder if that people could be around after every revolution and be able to access them. Sometimes the revolution just completely fails and the people are inaccessible, or it wins and then there's kind of new stories that are told ex post facto. But in this case, it was something indeterminate where the revolution failed, but then the people were all dispersed and kind of still living with their memories, and it was like a kind of fruitful opportunity as a result to be able to capture some of these things. But I think if you were to look at other revolutions in as granular detail, I would be surprised if you didn't find similar trajectories for most people.
Yeah. So I think that part of how this book will be understood is as a geopolitical discussion. And we do have a question that's related to that. So can you share your perspective as to why the Syrian people were abandoned by the Western left and the West in general, except for Rojava, she adds. They have a big fan club here, which I don't think you're equally a fan club of, although, yeah, go.
Well, that's a good question. I think that for a long time and still to this day, the Western left has primarily viewed the rest of the world through the categories and prerogatives of its own struggle with its own state, which means it's always prioritized opposing the policies of Western states, and although, however, not always honestly with themselves that this is what's happening. So sadly, what happened in Syria, people rising up for democracy and freedom, and it just so happened that the leader that they're rising up, the dictator they're rising up against, was putatively opposed to the West and to Israel. And I say putatively because in practice there was a modus vivendi between between Israel and Assad and the United States. But I think the rhetoric, Assad said he's part of the axis of resistance and it's there to defend Palestine, even though he never lifted a finger ever to defend Palestine. I think that was unfortunately sufficient for a lot of left. And I think a second problem, maybe this goes going back to some of our earlier discussion about categories and stuff. We tend to want to think that these things come in neat categories, that, we don't have Marxist revolutionaries that came up in Syria, for instance. So therefore, this can't be a revolution, Whereas in real life, this almost never works that way, or it hasn't since 1920 or something. So, I think both of those are the challenges. And so a lot of the left says, well, I'm going to prioritize opposing my government. And that's unfortunate because that's forgetting the other obligation of a leftist is kind of internationalism, which is you always want to solidarize with people who are struggling against oppression, first and foremost, not against the states that are oppressing people.
Yeah. Well, maybe say something about, because I even made the same mistake the first time we talked about this. I assumed that you were talking about the Kurds.
Yeah.
And
Rojava.
Abalos is a Kurd.
Yes.
But, I think he's the only one in the story that gets named. These are not Kurds. And in fact, the relationship eventually with the Kurdish militia is not happy.
Yeah.
So
Manbij is a city, predominantly Arab city, about 90%, but there are other groups, Kurds, Circassians, and others that live in the city. When ISIS, which ruled the city after the democratic experiment, when it's overthrown in a coalition with the American special forces and the Kurdish groups that are connected, ultimately through various front groups connected to the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So these two forces overthrew ISIS and liberated the city from ISIS, actually. Mm-hmm. And then people were very hopeful at that moment because they're being delivered from the grips of ISIS. And the front group that ruled the city is called the Syrian Democratic Forces. So people were hopeful. This is democracy. In practice, unfortunately, it was anything but democratic. It was a dictatorship. There was no freedom of speech or assembly. I know so many people who've been disappeared off the streets for speaking up against this government. I mean, on paper, it was set up as a kind of anarchist paradise where you had these councils and these self-governing councils. This is Rojava, right? So members is part of Rojava. These self-governing councils with a man and woman heading the council, but behind all these councils was the PKK running everything with an iron fist. And so in the same way in which the Western left, I think, misread what happened in the Syrian revolution and tended to oppose it in the name of quote unquote anti-imperialism. In the same way, I think another section of the Western left also misread what happened in Rojava. There was a lot of propaganda put out by the people in Rojava saying this is a sort of anarchist, democratic, confederalist experiment. It was none of those things. It wasn't anarchist at all. It was an authoritarian state. It wasn't democratic at all. It also, by the way, was quite neoliberal in its economic policy. So that's an amazing propaganda coup that they was able to undertake.
Okay. I believe that concludes our discussion. Anand Gopal, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you.
The book is Days of Love and Rage. Pick it up, read it. It's terrific. Thank you.